We're here today to really get into some quite challenging, but I think absolutely crucial ideas that are shaping contemporary thought.
That's right. We're going deep into the work of thinkers who are asking us to fundamentally reframe how we look at, well, everything really. Global history, current conflicts, power structures. We're talking about figures like Sylvia Wynter, Annabel Quijano, Walter Mignolo.
And the central thread, the mission for this deep dive, is to unpack their argument about, well, about the very definition of human. They argue that Western knowledge, Western power, it's all built on a very specific ethno-class definition of humanity.
Exactly, a definition they often refer to as man, with a capital M. And the core proposition, the really startling one, is that this definition, this idea of man, is actually in direct conflict with the well-being of the human species as a whole.
Okay, so that's a huge claim. The idea that the dominant concept of humanity is actively harmful to humanity itself.
It is. The source material frames it as a core paradox, that securing the well-being of this specific Western bourgeois ideal of man inherently undermines the well-being and even the cognitive autonomy of most people on the planet.
So we're not talking about colonialism just as historical conquest, flags and territories, but something much deeper, right? A kind of cognitive structure.
Precisely. It's what's often termed the coloniality of being, or power, or truth, or freedom. It suggests these structures of thinking, of defining reality, persist long after formal colonial rule ended.
Right, so let's break that down. Coloniality of power, being, truth. What do these terms mean in this framework? We need to get a handle on them.
Well, Quijano's coloniality of power is probably the most known. It refers to that global structure of dominance that emerged with European modernity, fundamentally based on the invention of race and a particular kind of global capitalism.
Okay, race and capitalism as intertwined pillars.
Yes. But the coloniality of being and truth go, well, arguably deeper. They suggest that our very concepts of what's rational, what's true, what's beautiful, what's progress, even what it means to be fully human, these were all codified by the colonizing West and imposed as universal standards.
Imposed as the way of knowing and being.
Exactly. And the key mechanism for this, according to the sources we're looking at, is this overrepresentation of man.
Man with a capital M again. So this isn't generic mankind.
No, absolutely not. It refers specifically to that idealized figure rooted in the Western bourgeoisie, the self-determining, rational, property-owning, secular individual. This figure, this man, has been presented as the universal template for the entire species.
And the sources say this acts like a kind of secular racism.
Yes, Winter argues it functions as a second, purely secular form of the racism-ethnicism complex that Quijano identified. It's a cognitive tool, really, for creating and enforcing difference and hierarchy, but now dressed up in secular rational terms instead of purely religious ones.
Okay, if the supposed generic human is actually this very specific, historically located man, well, that forces you to reevaluate pretty much every major global issue, doesn't it?
It completely reframes them. This is where Walter Mignolo's concept of the colonial difference comes in. He sees it as the foundational split, the mechanism through which modernity established itself.
The U.S. versus them, but built into the very structure of knowledge.
Essentially, yes.
Yep.
And so all the crises we talk about, race, class, gender struggles, environmental destruction, climate change, the massive inequalities in resource distribution, they're not seen as separate problems in this framework.
They're symptoms.
They're presented as facets, symptoms,
Yeah.
of this one central struggle.
Yeah.
The conflict between the imperatives of this overrepresented man and the actual well-being of the diverse human species and the planet.
Let's make that more concrete. You mentioned resource distribution. How does this ethno-class dominance manifest in material terms? The sources give some figures, right?
They do, and the figures are stark. They really highlight the outcome of a system prioritizing one specific group's mode of being. The data pointed to shows roughly 20% of the world's population owning and consuming something like 80% of the planet's resources.
20% consuming 80%. That's staggering.
It is. And that same 20% consumes about 2/3 of the world's food supply, and is responsible for maybe 75% of global pollution. The consequence, the mathematical outcome described, is that billions, literally billions of people, live in conditions of profound immiseration, what the sources sometimes call a state of chronic social death.
While a smaller group lives in relative affluence, protected by these very structures.
Protected by the structures that define and uphold man, yes.
So this isn't accidental. The system produces this outcome. And to understand how it's maintained, the sources talk about identifying who gets defined as dispensable.
Exactly. This connects to Zygmunt Bauman's concept of the new poor. But it's used here in a slightly different way, maybe. It's not just about being exploited for labor, like in classic Marxist analysis.
How is it different?
It's about being deemed superfluous, redundant to the needs of the dominant global bioeconomic system, the system run according to the logic of man, too, which we'll get into.
Okay, so who falls into this category of the new poor globally?
Well, globally, you see it in the vast numbers of displaced people, refugees, climate migrants, economic migrants trying to survive, the billions who are effectively locked out of the affluent zones. They are described as the contemporary version of finance les damnés, the wretched of the earth.
The people whose very existence, in a grim way, confirms the protected status of those inside the system.
That's the argument. Their exclusion validates the inclusion of others. But crucially, the sources insist this isn't just an external phenomenon, something happening over there.
It has internal versions within the core countries, too.
Yes. Within the U.S., for example, the argument points to the hyper-criminalized populations in inner cities, particularly black and dark-skinned Latino males. They're disproportionately channeled into the prison industrial complex.
Becoming a kind of internal, disposable population.
Right. Along with their female counterparts, often stereotyped as welfare moms. The sources argue they are structurally positioned as the internal new poor, economically marginalized but ideologically essential for maintaining the boundaries of who counts as the normal citizen defined by man.
And the sources draw a direct line, a parallel, between this internal group and the situation in the global south. That seems like a really critical connection they're making.
It's a central part of the analysis. They argue there's a systemic link, a parallel logic, connecting the status of these internally marginalized, criminalized groups in places like the U.S. to the condition of peoples across the third and fourth worlds.
And they point to specific examples globally.
Yes. The most extreme examples given are the continent of Africa, often portrayed as a site of perpetual crisis, and nations like Haiti, described as being systemically produced as the poorest nation in the Americas.
Produced, meaning it's not just an unfortunate outcome, but a necessary structural position within the larger system.
That's the implication, that the subjugation, the positioning of black populations at what the sources might call the nigger rung, the absolute bottom of the symbolic hierarchy, is indispensable. It validates the entire descriptive statement of the ethnoclass man for everyone else.
Wow. So the system needs this lowest category, this visible, diselected other, to make the selected status of everyone else seem natural and justified.
That's precisely the argument. It's presented as a key mechanism. You even see it, the sources suggest, when some non-black immigrant groups distance themselves from black populations to assert their own belonging within the dominant North American identity structure.
It confirms that the struggle against this systemic othering, particularly of the black population, isn't just one issue among many.
It's framed as the central, often unnamed struggle. It's about dismantling the overrepresentation of man that underpins all these other hierarchies.
Okay, so to really understand this current figure of man, this man too we've touched on, the sources say we have to go back to its origins, tracing the shift from a world defined by Christian identity to the first secular version, man one.
Exactly. We need to understand the starting point. Before modernity really kicks in Latin Christian Europe, the primary matrix identity wasn't national or racial, it was Christian.
Defined how?
Theocentrically. God was seen as the ultimate author of the social order. And the descriptive statement of the human, the basic understanding of what a human was essentially sinful by nature. You were defined by the legacy of original sin.
And this wasn't just an abstract belief, right? It structured society.
Absolutely. It directly legitimated the power, the hegemony of the clergy over the lay population. The clergy, being celibate and dedicated to the spiritual, were seen as closer to God, less mired in the sinful flesh that defined ordinary lay life.
And the sources also mentioned this theology was reflected in their understanding of the cosmos itself.
Yes. The cosmology reinforced the theology. The earth, home to fallen humanity, was seen as base, corrupt matter, fixed and unmoving at the center of the universe. This created a fundamental separation, a non-homogeneity, between the imperfect earth and the perfect spiritual heavens.
So the physical universe mirrored the social hierarchy.
It validated the whole system, the spirit-flesh divide, the clergy-laity hierarchy. It kept everything locked in place, divinely ordained.
Until the Renaissance humanists started to challenge this. This is the moment they call the invention of man, or man one.
Yes, this is the first major secular break. The lay world starts to carve out an identity independent from the church's definition. The new identity becomes man, conceived primarily as the political subject of the emerging state, no longer primarily defined by sin.
And there's a key text associated with this shift.
Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man from the late 15th century is often cited as a kind of manifesto of this new conception.
Right, the Oration. How did Pico manage to create a secular origin story, essentially, while still working within a Christian context?
It was a very clever move. He reinterpreted Genesis. In his version, God places Adam at the midpoint of creation, but crucially gives him no fixed nature or predetermined destiny. Man is free to sculpt himself, to choose whether to degenerate towards the brutes or ascend towards the divine.
So the problem shifts. It's no longer innate original sin requiring divine grace,
But rather the potential enslavement to our own irrational aspects, our passions, our ignorance. The path to salvation in this new secular frame becomes adherence to reason, participation in the rational state, serving the common good.
On the surface, this sounds like progress, right? Opening the door for reason, science, the Enlightenment. But the sources warn about a Janus face here, a fundamental contradiction baked in from the start.
This paradox is absolutely central to the decolonial critique. On one hand, yes, this invention of man one, the shift towards reason and secularity, did make possible new ways of thinking. It allowed for the idea of natural causality, paving the way for the physical sciences, like Newtonian physics.
Why? How did freeing man free the cosmos?
Because the cosmos no longer had to serve as the direct mirror validating the theological social order. It could be studied more objectively on its own terms. But, and this is the critical but, this intellectual liberation for European man was achieved only through and depended upon the simultaneous institutionalization of the colonized-to-colonized relationship across the globe.
Aha. So the freedom and rationality of man one required the creation and subjugation of a human other defined as unfree and irrational.
Precisely. But since man one was a secular political identity, it couldn't use the old theological arguments like infidel to justify this new hierarchy. It needed a new basis.
A non-supernatural justification for dominance.
Exactly. And this, Annabel Chiano argues forcefully, is where the concept of race is invented. Not discovered, invented.
Invented how?
As a purely socio-political construct with no real biological basis, designed specifically to ground this new human-subhuman distinction. It allowed the West to replace the old theological divide, believer, infidel, mortal, immortal, with a supposedly natural biological one based on phenotype and origin. Race became the secular anchor for the racism-ethnicism complex.
So race wasn't just describing difference, it was creating a hierarchy to justify the colonial project.
That's the argument. The new identity of man one needed its opposite, its untrue other, to validate itself. And the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Indians and enslaved Africans, Negroes, were systematically transformed into the living embodiments of this irrational or subrational human other.
They took the place previously held by heretics or infidels in the symbolic order.
Yes, but crucially, the difference was now supposedly rooted in their nature, not just their beliefs or choices.
And the sources point out a difference even in how Indians and Negroes were positioned within this hierarchy of the other.
Yes, there was often a differentiation. Indigenous peoples were frequently portrayed as savage or irrational, lacking reason perhaps, but often seen as potentially convertible, capable of being brought into the fold, albeit in a subordinate position.
But the positioning of the Negro was different.
It rapidly became far more extreme, according to this analysis. The Negro was constructed as the ultimate other, the figure supposedly closest to the animal realm, the missing link. This placed the African at the absolute bottom of the ontological scale, establishing that fundamental human-subhuman value distinction.
And this distinction then served as the primary justification for unprecedented levels of exploitation.
Yes, for the large-scale expropriation of both land from indigenous peoples and labor, primarily through the enslavement of Africans, legitimizing the entire colonial enterprise on supposedly natural grounds.
Okay, so this theoretical clash, the old Christian worldview versus the new secular rational man one, wasn't just abstract. It played out dramatically in the Las Casas dispute in Spain in the mid-16th century.
Absolutely. This debate in Valladolid was a pivotal moment. Yet Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar, arguing from a more traditional universalist Christian perspective for the humanity of the American Indians.
And opposing him.
Ginés de Sepúlveda, a humanist scholar and the royal historian who was championing the arguments aligned with the emerging rationalist identity of the state, the logic of man one. The Spanish crown itself was facing a legitimacy crisis.
Why couldn't they just rely on the old justifications for conquest?
Well, the traditional theological justification, based on papal bulls granting dominion over non-Christian lands, often required the conquered to be proven enemies of Christ, people who had heard the gospel and actively rejected it.
But that didn't apply in the Americas.
No, because the apostles had never reached the New World. So the Indians couldn't be technically classified as willful rejectors of Christ under that specific legal framework. The crown needed a new, arguably more secular basis to legitimize its sovereignty and exploitation.
And Sepulveda provided one, drawing on rediscovered classical philosophy.
He did. He revived and adapted a neo-Aristotelian argument, drawing from thinkers like John Mayer. The core idea was that sovereignty shouldn't depend on religious status, but on the inherent nature of the people involved. This led directly to the thesis of natural slaves.
Natural slaves, based on Aristotle's idea that some people are just inherently suited for rule and others for being ruled.
Exactly. Sepulveda argued that the Indians were naturally inferior to the Spanish, comparing the difference to that between children and adults, women and men, and even infamously almost as monkeys are to men. He called them homunculi, little men, establishing this difference as innate by nature.
That shift from a potentially changeable status like infidel to an immutable natural inferiority is, well, that's the core mechanism of coloniality of being right there, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It makes the hierarchy seem ontological, part of the fabric of reality itself. And we get this incredible snapshot of the clash of worldviews from the story of the Sinu Indians' response to the Spanish Requisition.
The Requisition being that document the Spanish read out demanding submission.
Yes, a formal legalistic document read often in Latin or Spanish to peoples who understood neither, explaining that God gave the world to the Pope, who gave the Americas to the Spanish monarchs, and therefore they must submit or face righteous violence.
And the Senu response just highlights the utter absurdity of this from their perspective.
It's profoundly revealing. According to the accounts, they listened patiently and then replied that the Pope must have been drunk to give away what wasn't his, and the king must have been mad to ask for it. It shows the complete incommensurability of the Spanish truth for their self-justifying narrative outside of its own cultural context.
So facing Sepulveda's argument based on natural reason and using practices like Aztec human sacrifice as proof of irrationality, how did Las Casas counter?
Las Casas made a really remarkable argument described in the sources as a kind of transcultural insight. He didn't deny the practice of human sacrifice, but he argued it wasn't proof of a lack of reason.
How did he frame it then?
He argued that, within the Aztec belief system, sacrificing individuals for the perceived salvation of the entire community was actually a deeply pious, rational, and virtuous act, according to their understanding of the cosmos and their gods. He framed it as an error of reason itself, a mistaken application of reason, but not an absence of it.
So their reasoning capacity was intact, but their premises, their cultural software, was different. And he made a broader point about consciousness, too.
Yes, this is maybe his most profound contribution cited here. He stated, and this is a near quote, that a mistaken consciousness, conscience, la conciencia errónea, obliges and compels exactly the same way as does the true, correct one.
Meaning any culturally ingrained belief system feels absolutely real and binding to those within it.
Exactly. He was touching on the idea that human groups inevitably auto-institute their own rules, their own descriptive statements about reality, and once those are in place, they feel just as compelling and true to those members as Christianity felt to the Spaniards. It's an early glimpse into the idea of sociogyny, of culturally specific modes of being.
Yet, despite this incredibly nuanced defense of the Indians' humanity, Las Casas tragically played a role in worsening the fate of Africans.
It's a deeply tragic irony he later bitterly regretted. In his desperation to alleviate the suffering of the Indians under the brutal encomienda system, a system he knew was killing them, and lacked justification even under the new Man One framework, he made a fateful suggestion.
Which was?
He initially proposed importing a limited number of African slaves, believing, catastrophically wrongly, that they were already being enslaved in Africa through just wars or other means that gave Spain a just title to their labor, unlike the Indians.
And this proposal, intended to save one group, had devastating consequences for another.
It inadvertently provided theological and political cover that helped grease the wheels for the massive expansion of the transatlantic slave trade over the next 4 centuries. It helped cement the differential status. Indians were eventually recognized, at least nominally, as vassals of the crown needing protection, while Africans, the Negroes, were definitively categorized as chattel, property, the ultimate natural slaves.
So that initial differentiation in the 16th century laid the groundwork for the enduring, profound stigmatization within the coloniality of being that persists today.
That's the argument. The die was cast very early on, establishing that hierarchical distinction based on perceived nature.
Okay, so Man 1 emerges the political subject, grounded in reason, but requiring the racialized other. Then, the sources argue, comes a second major transformation, driven by liberalism and the bourgeoisie. The shift from Man 1 to Man 2, the biocentric human.
Yes, this second mutation sought to complete the secularization project. Man 1, the political subject of the state, is redefined, optimized perhaps, into Man 2, who is fundamentally the economic subject. The individual whose primary role is to master scarcity, compete, accumulate capital.
And this needed a new grounding, moving further away from any lingering religious or even purely political definitions.
Right, and this is where the scientific revolution of the mid-19th century, particularly Darwin's work, becomes crucial, but in a paradoxical way.
The Darwinian paradox. How so?
Well, Darwin's theory of evolution, describing humans as purely biological beings shaped by natural processes, was obviously a monumental scientific achievement. It enabled the modern biological sciences. However, the sources argue it was also co-opted to provide a new, entirely secular, and seemingly extra-human origin story and justification for the social order of Man 2.
So evolution and natural selection become the new divine plan, in a sense.
In a functional sense, yes. It provided a mythic charter grounded in nature itself. And if the old ill that Man 1 sought to overcome was irrationality, what was the great ill for Man 2?
That's where Malthus comes in.
Exactly. Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population provided the defining problem for this new era: natural scarcity. The idea that population inherently grows faster geometrically than food supply arithmetically.
So the fundamental struggle isn't sin or irrationality, but this relentless biological pressure of scarcity.
Correct. And therefore, the plan of salvation shifts again. It's no longer about faith or political reason primarily, but about economic mastery. Success in the competitive marketplace, accumulation of capital, efficient management, these become the signs of virtue, the proof of being fit or selected in the struggle for existence.
So the responsibility for the social order gets projected outwards again, not onto God this time.
But onto the supposedly impersonal extra-human forces of evolution and natural selection, operating through the seemingly autonomous mechanism of the invisible hand of the free market. It makes the existing inequalities look like the natural outcome of biological and economic laws.
And this new bioeconomic order needed its own way to mark difference, its own principle of hierarchy.
Yes, the old lines, heaven, earth, rational, irrational, are effectively replaced or overlaid by what W.E.B. Du Bois famously called the color line, a global line drawn between lighter-skinned peoples, associated with Man 2, and darker-skinned peoples, positioned as less evolved or less adapted. Phenotype becomes the key marker.
Anchored in visible difference. And this color line then dictates the new code of symbolic life and death.
Precisely. The master code becomes selected by evolution versus disselected by evolution.
How does that play out socially?
Well, if you achieved economic success, you were an investor, a provider, a breadwinner. Your success was read as proof of your inherent fitness, your selection, linking to eugenics thinking. Conversely, poverty, unemployment, perceived criminality. These were read as signs of inherent unfitness, of being disselected by nature, linking to dysgenics.
And crucially, this wasn't seen as a result of social structures or history,
but rather as the inevitable outcome of this bioevolutionary struggle. The poor were poor because they were naturally lazy, less intelligent, less fit. It naturalizes social hierarchy in a very powerful way.
Okay, which brings us back to the specific role assigned to the Black other in this Man 2 framework, especially in places like the U.S. If it's all about economic fitness, why is the Negro, as the sources term it, made the absolute lowest marker, even compared to other poor groups?
The argument is that the Negroid physiognomy, and by symbolic extension, the continent of Africa, are constructed as the ultimate signifiers of being disselected by evolution. This extreme bottom position isn't accidental. It serves a crucial systemic function.
Which is?
It functions as the central psychic compensatory mechanism, particularly for the white working classes and poor whites within the system.
Okay, psychic compensatory mechanism. Let's unpack that. What does it mean in practice? How does it work?
It means that even though poor or working class whites might themselves feel economically precarious or disselected in the harsh terms of market capitalism, Their racial identity provides a crucial buffer. They are encouraged to identify with the dominant white bourgeois group based on shared whiteness, shared selection status relative to the black population.
So, by seeing the black population positioned below them, often visibly marginalized, criminalized, impoverished.
It confirms their own relative selected status, despite their economic struggles. It provides a sense of superiority and belonging, relieving the psychological stress of their own class subordination. It makes them feel aligned with the powerful based on race, even if they're economically exploited by them.
So the constant reinforcement of black failure through media, statistics on poverty, incarceration, etc., isn't just reflecting reality, it's actively producing the ideological glue that holds the whole racial class hierarchy together for the dominant group.
That's precisely the argument presented. It validates the idea that white supremacy is natural, deserved, the outcome of evolutionary fitness. And that's why, the argument goes, the system has a vested interest in maintaining that bottom rung.
Because if that group achieved genuine equality,
The whole psychic compensation system would fracture. The shared racial identity holding poor whites to the system, despite class antagonism, would weaken, potentially opening up a real challenge to the class structure itself.
wow, okay. And the ultimate intellectual outcome of this whole man-to biocentric worldview is what C.P. Snow called the two cultures divide.
Yes, this biocentric framework effectively splits knowledge. On one side, you have the natural sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, which are seen as achieving objective, non-adaptive knowledge about the non-human world. Real truth about reality out there.
But the other side of the humanities and social sciences.
They get implicitly relegated, the argument goes, to a different function. While rigorous in their own methods, they largely operate as adaptive truth-force systems. Their primary, often unconscious, function becomes to study and explain the human world in ways that can serve the descriptive statement of man, too.
So they study human society, but mostly through the lens of this specific ethno-class definition of the human, reinforcing its normality.
Yes, they end up studying man as if he represents the entirety of the human, thereby reproducing the very ethno-class assumptions that underpin the current order, rather than achieving a truly non-adaptive science of the human condition itself.
Okay, so we've traced man one, the political subject, born from secular reason but needing the racial other, and man two, the biocentric economic subject justified by evolution and the market, also needing its disselected other. The critical question now becomes, how do we move beyond this? How do we unsettle the coloniality and move toward the human after man?
Well, the sources suggest the initial cracks in the edifice appeared forcefully in the mid-20th century, with the wave of anti-colonial movements and the social protests in the West addressing what were then called the colonial question, the native question, the Negro question.
These movements challenge the system directly.
They fundamentally expose the gap, the yawning chasm, between the dominant reality constructed by man's worldview that adaptive truth for and the lived reality of the majority of people on Earth. They reveal the constructedness of the dominant narrative.
But the argument is that many of these challenges were ultimately contained, co-opted back into the system. Why didn't they lead to a complete rupture?
The analysis suggests they often lacked their own distinct theoretical paradigm. They ended up being reframed within existing Western frameworks like Marxism or liberal rights discourse. They were labeled the Third World Question or the Minority Question, which implicitly kept them as variations within the world defined by man too, rather than a challenge to that world itself.
But there was one major exception noted.
Yes, the feminist movement is often highlighted. It succeeded, arguably, in redefining its struggle outside the dominant paradigms, specifically identifying its core issue as gender sexism, targeting the deep cognitive and social structures of patriarchy itself, rather than just seeing women's issues as secondary to class struggle, for example.
So, following that logic, if feminism targeted the genre of gender, what should the anti-colonial and black liberation struggles have focused on? What's the equivalent genre?
The argument is they needed to be reframed, and still need to be, as addressing the genre of the human itself. The target isn't just political independence or economic equality within the existing system, but the abolition of the ethno-class mode of being man, which structures that system.
A much deeper, more fundamental cognitive and existential shift.
Exactly. It requires moving beyond demands framed in man's terms and initiating a new way of understanding ourselves, understanding how we, as humans, actually create our social realities.
Which connects to the idea from thinkers like Terence Deacon or Maurice Godelier that humans are unique in being self-representing, auto-instituting creatures.
Yes. We create our own symbolic worlds, our own social orders, our own rules for being human. But the core contradiction, the mechanism of coloniality, is that we systematically repress the knowledge of our own authorship. We pretend the rules come from God or nature or the market anywhere but ourselves.
And overcoming that repression requires a new kind of knowledge.
Conscious self-cognition. And this echoes a call made much earlier by Aimé Césaire back in 1946.
Césaire's call for a new science.
Yes, he called for a science of the word, what Wynter later develops as sociogyny, a science specifically equipped to understand the human domain, to complement the natural sciences which, Césaire felt, were half-starved, because they couldn't account for our symbolic, self-creating nature.
So what would this science of sociogyny actually study?
It would focus on the sociogenic principles, the narratively inscribed, culturally specific rules, codes, and descriptive statements, like man 1 or man 2, that govern our behavior and shape our perception of reality. It would study how we collectively script ourselves into being particular kinds of humans.
So instead of just studying economic systems or political structures, it studies the rules and stories that generate those systems.
Precisely. Fanon also moved in this direction, talking about modes of sociogyny as a necessary new object of knowledge. For Fanon, understanding these modes is essential if we want to define the human outside the restrictive terms set by any one group, particularly the dominant ethnoclass of man.
The goal being cognitive liberation, freedom from the truth for of man.
Yes. To achieve a truly non-adaptive knowledge, not just of stars or atoms, but of ourselves and our social worlds. Sociogyny would analyze things like the shift from Las Casas' mistaken conscience argument to the modern diselected by evolution status, seeing both not as inherent truths, but as specific, historically produced outputs of different sociogenic codes.
But there's a major hurdle for intellectuals trying to develop this, especially those from the colonized or marginalized world, right? Sartre pointed this out in his preface to Fanon's work.
It's a profound dilemma. The colonized intellectual, the thinker from the impoverished world, is often forced to make their arguments using the language, the concepts, the very intellectual frameworks developed by and for man. The word, the dominant discourse, is owned by the colonizer.
So they end up having to justify their humanity in the oppressor's terms.
They often get trapped in merely echoing the terms of man's superiority, trying to prove we are rational too, we are economically capable too. This validates the framework even while challenging its outcomes, rather than shattering the framework itself. The system is profoundly structured to repress the knowledge that we, all of us, collectively are the authors of these world-making paradigms.
So the ultimate aim is to break free from that adaptive loop, to recognize that man is just one possible way of being human, not the only way.
That's the necessary leap, the intellectual rupture required. It means shifting our understanding of causation away from purely external forces, God, biology, market, towards recognizing the nature-culture modality, the interplay of our biology, ontogeny, and our self-created cultural programming, sociogyny. We need to see how we script ourselves.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the core argument we've explored is that our current global crises stem from a fundamental problem of definition, from the historical invention of a specific ethnoclass identity man, which required, by its very logic, the creation of a subhuman other.
That's the essence of it. And the path forward proposed by these thinkers isn't just about political reform or economic redistribution, as crucial as those are. It requires a deeper shift toward conscious self-cognition.
Meaning humanity needs to become aware of the rules, the codes, the stories, the sociogenic principles by which we collectively produce and reproduce our specific ways of being human.
Exactly. Until we recognize that our current dominant mode of being man is just one culturally specific answer to the question, what is human, we'll likely continue to sacrifice the well-being of the species and the planet to maintain the dominance of that one limited ethnoclass definition.
This sounds like an intellectual task even greater than the one that enabled the scientific revolution, becoming conscious authors of our own social reality.
It's framed as precisely that kind of epical shift. And that notion of conscious authorship brings us perfectly to a final thought for you, the listener, to take away. It's from the very end of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks.
What did Fanon say?
He wrote, "The true leap consists in introducing invention into existence."
Invention into existence.
Yes. The challenge isn't just to understand how our current reality, our current man was historically offered. The true leap is to consciously, collectively, take up the task of inventing and authoring a different way of being human, a way that moves beyond the destructive overrepresentation of man.